It began so quietly that he almost missed it. The slow drift of silence between his father and the woman, the faint edge in her laughter. The way she started keeping her phone face down on the table. At first, he thought it was nothing. People change, love shifts. But then came the night he heard her crying in the kitchen. Her voice breaking into words that weren't meant for his father. He should have stopped listening, but he didn't. From the hallway, he heard her whisper another man's name. The sound was soft, trembling, not shameful, not afraid, but tender. That was what cut the deepest. Tenderness. The kind she never showed at home anymore. He stood there, frozen, his heart a stone lodged in his chest. When she hung up, she stood for a long moment in the dark, her hand pressed over her mouth. As though holding in a truth that had already escaped. The next morning, she smiled at breakfast as if nothing had happened. The father, tired but still gentle, poured her coffee, asked about her plans. She lied so easily, the son could barely look at her. The sound of her voice, warm, kind, practiced, made him sick. Days turned into weeks. The son began watching her without meaning to. How she stayed late at work. How her phone lit up and she turned away. How her laugh returned, that soft, private laugh that didn't belong in this house anymore. One afternoon, he followed her. She met the man in a park on the other side of town. There was no hesitation, no guilt. They held each other like two people who had already decided the world could burn as long as they stayed warm. He didn't take a picture. He didn't need to. The image was already carved into him. That night, he came home before her. His father was in the living room, fixing a lamp, humming softly. The sight of him, calm, unaware, broke something inside the son. He wanted to tell him everything, but the words wouldn't come. How do you tell someone that the person they love most has already left? Even while she's still in the room? So he said nothing. But silence is never neutral. It festers. It grows teeth. He began leaving small traces, not enough to accuse, just enough to unsettle. A stranger's perfume on her scarf, moved from her drawer to the hall. A message he forwarded from her phone to his father's. A receipt from a hotel slipped into the pocket of her coat. She never knew where the cracks came from, only that they were spreading. He told himself it was justice. He told himself she deserved it. When the confrontation finally came, it was quiet. His father stood in the doorway, her phone in his hand, his face gray and still. How long? He asked. She didn't answer. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she didn't see the point. The shouting came later. The breaking, the crying. The sound of the front door slamming open and shut. When it was over, the father sat at the kitchen table, head in his hands. Breathing like a man who had just learned what drowning felt like on dry land. The son stood behind him, unseen but not innocent. He had wanted this moment, and now that it was here, it felt nothing like victory. The woman left that night. She didn't take much, just a suitcase and her silence. The father didn't follow. The son didn't stop her. For days, the house felt like a wound that wouldn't close. His father spoke little, moved slower, carried grief like something sacred. And the son realized too late that he had destroyed her, yes, but in doing so, he had destroyed him too. Weeks later, the father found the receipt, the one the son had planted. He turned it over in his hand, his eyes narrowing with a dawning understanding. He didn't say anything then, but something in his gaze changed. That evening, he asked, "You knew, didn't you?" The son couldn't lie. He nodded once. The father's voice was calm, but not forgiving. You could have told me the truth. You didn't have to become her to make me see it. The words hit harder than any slap. From then on, they lived in the same house but on different sides of the silence. The father never mentioned her again. But sometimes the son caught him staring at the empty chair by the window, his face unreadable. Years later, when the son thought back to that time, he could still hear his father's voice, that quiet, final truth. You didn't just watch her destroy our family, he had said. You helped her do it. And the son, older now, understood. Vengeance doesn't end where betrayal does. It only keeps the fire alive long after there's nothing left to burn. After she left, the house felt hollow, not just empty, but wrong. As if the walls themselves knew what had been taken from them. The father moved like a man learning to breathe again, slow and shallow. The son watched him drift through the days, silent, practical. Surviving on habit instead of hope. He had imagined that once she was gone, the house would feel cleaner, lighter. Instead, every room was heavy with what he had done. He found her perfume still clinging to the curtains, her sweater folded neatly on a chair. Her absence wasn't a wound, it was an echo. The kind that never stops repeating the last thing you wish you hadn't heard. The father never spoke of her again. Not once. He repaired what she broke, replaced what she took, and rebuilt his routines piece by piece. The son tried to do the same, but guilt has a way of staining everything it touches. One night, he sat at the table where everything had fallen apart, the same table where his father had stood holding her phone, where the shouting began. Where her ring had been left behind like an accusation. He placed his hands flat against the wood. As if he could still feel the vibrations of that night. He had wanted revenge, and he had gotten it. He had watched the destruction unfold exactly as he planned. But now that he had what he wanted, all he felt was hollow. When his father entered the kitchen, the older man paused by the doorway. Can't sleep? The son shook his head. His father poured a cup of water, then sat across from him. For a while, neither spoke. Then, the father said quietly, I know what you did. The son's breath caught. You mean? The man nodded. The messages. The receipt. You made sure I'd find them. The son's throat tightened. You deserved to know. I did, his father said. But not like that. The words fell like a hammer between them. The son couldn't look up. You think she destroyed us, the father continued, his voice steady but tired. But you helped her finish the job. You turned her sin into your own. The son felt his chest ache, a sharp, relentless pressure. I didn't mean to. Yes, you did, the father interrupted. You wanted her to hurt. You wanted me to hurt. And you got what you wanted. Silence swallowed them. The air felt too heavy to breathe. Finally, the father stood. You can spend your whole life waiting for revenge to feel like justice. But it never does. He left without another word. The son sat there until dawn, the first light spilling across the floorboards like judgment. He realized that revenge didn't give you back what you lost, it only made sure you lost a little more. Weeks passed before they spoke again. When they finally did, it was small, ordinary things, groceries, repairs, weather. But beneath the words lived a quiet, fragile understanding. They were both guilty. And both grieving in their own way. One evening, the son went to the garden, where his father was tending the soil. The earth smelled of rain and something cleaner, renewal, maybe. He knelt beside him, helping without a word. After a while, his father said softly, "Let's stop building graves and start planting things." The son nodded, his hands sinking into the dirt. For the first time in months, the silence between them didn't feel like punishment. It felt like beginning. The woman was gone. The lies were gone. The vengeance was gone. And in their place, something small and honest had begun to grow. Spring returned slowly, as if even the seasons were cautious to touch what had been broken. The house no longer felt haunted, but it didn't feel alive either. It existed somewhere in between, a space suspended between grief and forgiveness. Between memory and forgetting. The father spoke little, though the heaviness in his eyes had softened. He spent his mornings in the garden, the earth beneath his hands turning dark and rich again. The son often joined him, both of them working quietly, letting the rhythm of soil and breath speak in place of words. It had been months since she left. The son no longer checked her old social media accounts, no longer scrolled through old photos, no longer replayed the sound of her laughter in his mind. But he couldn't stop thinking about that night, the look on his father's face when the truth surfaced, and the way he himself had stood in the shadows, watching everything burn that he had set alight. He told himself it had been necessary, that it was better to live with truth than with lies. But some nights, when the house was still, he'd catch himself wondering, was it really truth he wanted, or simply control? One evening, while cleaning, he found one of her scarves draped behind a drawer. It smelled faintly of her perfume, but the scent had faded into something ghost-like, half there, half gone. He folded it carefully, intending to throw it away, but his hand hesitated. He placed it in a box instead, alongside a few things he couldn't bring himself to destroy. A family photo, a pair of earrings, a note she'd once left on the fridge that said dinner at 6, don't forget to smile. Later, he took the box to the garden and buried it. Not as an act of forgiveness, he wasn't sure he believed in forgiveness, but as a way to stop carrying it. The soil accepted it without protest. When he turned, his father was watching from the porch. You didn't have to hide it, the older man said quietly. It's better there, the son replied. His father nodded, stepping closer. Maybe. But some things don't stay buried. They grow. They stood in silence for a while, the evening air cool against their skin. The son wanted to apologize, to confess that he had caused as much damage as she had, but the words tangled in his throat. Instead, he said, "Do you ever miss her?" The father thought for a long time before answering. Sometimes, he said, not who she became, just who she was when I still believed in her. The son nodded. He understood that kind of longing, the kind that isn't for a person, but for the version of them that once made you feel safe. That night, he dreamed of her. Not the way she looked in the end, but how she had been in the beginning, smiling, warm, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. In the dream, she wasn't lying. She was just there. When he woke, the light was spilling across the garden. His father was already outside, watering the soil where the box was buried. The son joined him, and together they stood in the quiet dawn. Something was changing. The house didn't feel as heavy anymore. The grief was still there, but it had begun to take a different shape, less sharp, less consuming. It felt like something living now. Something that might one day become memory instead of pain. He realized then that watching her destroy their family hadn't been the end of the story. It was what came after that mattered, the slow rebuilding, the quiet endurance. The decision to live even when love fails. And when he looked down at the soil, he noticed the first small sprout pushing through, green. Fragile, but real. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was growth. And that, finally, was enough. Summer arrived quietly, with long, Slow days that carried the scent of soil and warmth through the open windows. The house had changed again, less heavy now, less hollow. The father and son no longer tiptoed around the past. They spoke of it sometimes, gently, as one might speak of a wound that had long since stopped bleeding but still ached in the rain. One evening, the father came in from the garden, his hands dark with earth. He poured 2 cups of tea, set one in front of his son, and said, "I've been thinking. Maybe she didn't destroy the family. Maybe we did that to ourselves." The son frowned. "She's the one who lied." "Yes," the father said, nodding. "But I'm the one who believed her so easily. And you're the one who turned that truth into punishment." The words were soft, not accusing, just true. The son sat back, unable to argue. For months he had carried that same realization in silence. Revenge had felt right in the beginning, clean and sharp, like justice. But justice was supposed to heal, and nothing about what he had done had healed anything. That night, after his father went to bed, he sat alone at the kitchen table. The air was thick and warm. He could almost hear her voice again, faint. From somewhere deep inside memory, laughter that once filled this house before it fractured. He wondered if she ever thought of them, if she knew what her choices had cost. But then he remembered his father's words, and he realized the cost wasn't hers alone. The next morning, while sorting through the shed, he found an old photo album buried beneath tools and dust. Inside were pictures he hadn't seen in years. The 3 of them in the early days, his father smiling in the sunlight, her arm draped casually around his shoulder, the son standing between them, shy but content. It was strange to look at those faces now, knowing what would come. They looked happy. Maybe they truly had been, for a time. He brought the album to his father that evening. They sat together, flipping through the pages slowly. Every so often, one of them would point at a photo and say something small, an inside joke. A memory of a place, a fragment of a moment that had once mattered. When they reached the final page, the father sighed. "She wasn't all bad." The son nodded. "Neither were we." They closed the album. The room was quiet but not painfully so. Later, the son went to the garden, the place where everything seemed to end and begin. The soil was soft beneath his feet, still damp from his father's watering. He knelt, brushing the dirt where he had buried her scarf, the old photos. The last pieces of her he could not throw away. He realized, as he touched the earth, that he no longer felt the same sharp anger he once had. In its place was something gentler, something like acceptance. He whispered, "You were wrong, but I was worse." The wind moved through the leaves in response, brushing across his face. Neither forgiving nor condemning, just there. When he went back inside, he found his father asleep in the armchair. The photo album resting on his lap. The lamplight turned everything gold. For the first time, the house looked warm again, lived in, not haunted. He stood for a moment, watching the slow rise and fall of his father's chest, and thought about all the years they had survived. About how love, even ruined, still shaped them. About how grief, given enough time, could turn into understanding. Before going to bed, he opened the window and let the summer air in. The night was quiet, except for the faint hum of crickets and the soft whisper of wind against the trees. He thought of her one last time, not with hate, not with longing, but with a strange, steady gratitude, because even though she had destroyed the family, she had also forced what was left of it to begin again, smaller, humbler, but real. And for the first time, he realized that rebuilding wasn't betrayal to the past. It was the only kind of revenge that truly mattered. By autumn, the father's health had begun to fail. The son took care of him quietly, bringing tea, adjusting pillows, sitting beside him as the days grew shorter. The house no longer echoed like it once did. It breathed now, softly, like an old man sleeping. The ghosts still lived there, but they had stopped shouting. One afternoon, as the wind rattled the windows, the father said, "You know, I used to think she took everything from us. But I was wrong." The son looked up. "She didn't?" The father smiled faintly. "No, she only took what we were willing to let her take. I gave her trust. You gave her anger. We both gave her power." The son didn't respond. He stared into his tea, watching the steam fade, thinking about the truth of those words. For years he had believed she had destroyed them. But now, with time's quiet distance, he saw that destruction didn't always come from malice. Sometimes it came from weakness, from the small, slow choices that people make when they stop listening to each other. That night, the father asked to see the garden one last time. The son wrapped him in a coat and helped him outside. The tree they had planted together stood tall and golden under the setting sun. The father reached out, brushing the rough bark with trembling fingers. "You remember when you buried her things here?" he asked. The son nodded. "You planted something too, without knowing it," the father said. "You planted forgiveness." The words caught in his throat. "I don't think I forgave her," the son whispered. The father's gaze softened. "You did. You just didn't realize when." They stood in silence for a long moment, the air crisp, the leaves rustling gently. The son thought about that, how forgiveness could grow slowly, quietly, like a seed buried too deep to notice until it bloomed. A week later, the father was gone. He passed in his sleep, the faintest smile on his face. The son found a note on the nightstand in his handwriting. "When love fails, don't destroy what's left, build something from it instead." After the funeral, the son walked through the empty house, touching the walls, the photographs, the small, ordinary things that had survived everything else. He found the old family album again and opened it to the first page. There she was, his stepmother, smiling beside his father, her eyes bright, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. For a long time, he simply stared at that face. He didn't hate her anymore. Not because she deserved peace, but because he finally did. That evening, he returned to the garden. The wind had grown cold, and the tree's leaves had begun to fall, blanketing the ground in gold. He knelt, brushed aside the soil, and uncovered a small corner of the box where he'd buried her scarf and photographs. He didn't open it, he just rested his hand there and said softly, "It's over." The wind answered with a whisper through the branches, neither mournful nor kind, only true. As he stood, the world around him felt clearer, lighter. He realized that what had been destroyed had also been rebuilt, just differently. The family he'd lost existed now in memory, in roots, in the space that had grown between pain and understanding. That night, he sat on the porch with his camera. The sky was turning red, the kind of light his father used to call the color of forgiveness. He lifted the lens, pointed it at the house, and took a picture, not of the past, but of what remained. When he looked at the photo later, it wasn't sadness he saw. It was endurance. It was quiet. It was love, scarred and imperfect, but alive. And as the sun slipped behind the trees, he finally understood. He hadn't just watched his stepmother destroy their family. He had watched what remained learn how to live again. Winter came soft and gray, wrapping the world in silence. The son stayed in the house alone now. It no longer felt like a battlefield, just a place that had known too much and learned. Finally, to rest. The walls were still the same, the garden still grew wild outside. But the air carried something gentler, like the last breath after a storm. He moved through the rooms slowly, touching the furniture, the worn banister, the photographs that had outlived the people in them. There was peace here, but also a quiet ache, the kind that doesn't wound anymore. Only reminds you that you once bled. He often sat by the window his father had loved, watching the tree sway against the pale sky. It had grown thick and sturdy over the years, its branches twisting toward the light. Beneath it, deep in the soil, lay everything that had once bound them to pain, the box of memories, the ring, the scarf, all the things they had buried together. Now the earth had swallowed them whole, turning them into something living. Some evenings, when the light faded to silver, he thought of her, not as the woman who had destroyed them, but as a person he had finally learned to understand. She hadn't set out to ruin anything. She had just wanted to be seen, to feel something real before time and regret caught up to her. Her choices had broken them, but her absence had taught them how to rebuild. He no longer dreamed of revenge. He no longer replayed the night when everything fell apart. Instead, he dreamed of quieter things, his father's laugh echoing through the kitchen, the smell of rain on warm soil, the sound of her humming in another room before everything went wrong. One morning, he woke early and stepped outside. The frost covered everything, sparkling in the dawn. He crouched by the base of the tree and brushed away a patch of snow, exposing the soil. His fingers touched the cold earth. "It's all right now," he whispered. "It's done." A wind moved through the branches, scattering a few dry leaves. For a moment, he imagined it was a response, not from her, not from his father, but from the place itself, from the years that had held them all. He stood there a long time, until the sun rose, casting the house in gold. The camera hung around his neck, old but still working. He lifted it, aimed toward the tree, and pressed the shutter. The sound was soft, almost reverent. When the photo developed later, the image showed nothing extraordinary, just a tree in winter. Light, the sky stretching behind it. But looking at it, he felt something he hadn't in years. Calm. Completion. The understanding that some stories don't end with redemption or revenge, but with endurance, with people learning to live in the ruins and still find beauty there. That evening, he placed the photograph on the mantel beside the others. His father smiling in the garden, the family before the fracture, the house bathed in sunset. The newest picture didn't erase any of the others. It simply joined them, a final chapter written not in pain, but in peace. Before bed, he opened the window. The air was cold and clean. The world outside was silent except for the faint rustle of the tree. It no longer sounded like grief. It sounded like breath. He turned off the lights and sat for a moment in the dark, the weight of everything, love, loss, forgiveness, settling quietly in his chest. He had once watched his stepmother destroy their family. But now, years later, standing in the stillness she left behind, he understood the truth his father had once whispered: nothing stays broken forever. Some things grow again, just differently. And as the night deepened, he felt, at last, that it was over, not forgotten, not erased, but at peace.